I'm so glad you could all be here with us today to commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day with renowned Danish scholar Dr. Therkel Straede. Dr. Straede is a professor of contemporary history at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense. Dr. Straede has taught around the world, and he's the author of numerous articles and books. In 2001, Dr. Straede was awarded a congressional citation by the US House of Representatives for outstanding achievement in Holocaust research and education. So today, please feel free to share your questions for Dr. Straede in the Zoom chat, and we're going to address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And we're also, stay tuned, because we're going to talk about Dr. Straede's new project with the museum, the New York City Museum of Jewish Heritage, a new exhibit that will be opening in the fall. So before I turn this over to Dr. Straede, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Monmouth County Library for their support of this program. And now I am going to turn it over to Dr. Straede.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Robin, for your kind introduction. Thank you for bringing me in, and thank you to everyone who wants to spend some time on learning about the Danish rescue of 1943, because this is our topic for today. This is probably the time where I should share my screen. And that will happen. Okay, so yes, I think it's probably that I'm going to do address two topics. Many people all over the world are familiar with the fact that the Jews of Denmark were saved during the German occupation, and that Denmark sort of is being seen as a small candle in the big darkness of the Holocaust. The exception from the destruction of European Jewry, rescue, but also flight. If we talk about rescue, we mostly emphasize the role of non-Jews in helping Jews. If we talk about flight, we also emphasize very much the role of the Jews themselves in bringing themselves into safety, which actually was successful for most of them, but not all. I would, during my talk, I will try to give you an overview of what happened, like briefly, and then I will introduce you to some examples of personal stories that brings us close to the micro level insights, the micro level of this clandestine sealift operation that saved so many Danish Jews. We are in this wonderful position that newly released Swedish material has been made accessible on the internet, so that it is possible to get rather close to the operation itself. For obvious reasons, it did not leave very many records on the Danish side because everything was illegal. The Germans were not supposed to find out, and so on and so forth. But on the Swedish side, there was bureaucracy, and there was a receiving apparatus which produced records that we can use today to get very close to what happened. That is what I'm going to try to show to you. But I think probably we should start by simply getting straight where on earth is Denmark. So if you follow me, my cursor, this is more or less New York City, New Jersey, Monmouth, where you are sitting, at least some of you, and this is Denmark. This on the top of the European continent, kind of bridging the continent with the Scandinavian peninsula. I thought it would be helpful to see this map, which is a map actually demonstrating the extent of German rule during 1943, the time where the rescue was taking place in Denmark, the Germans controlled more or less the entire European continent, and they were on. They were kind of on the defensive on the Eastern Front, but still the areas that they controlled were far into the Soviet Union of those days. Most of the countries had been occupied. Some countries were allied with Germany and conducted their own Holocaust, like Romania, and and this is Central Germany itself. So on top of Germany, kind of, you have Denmark, and I'm zooming in on Denmark here. The Jutland Peninsula. Very few Jews lived in that part of the country, which was kind of fortunate because this is the part of Denmark where a rather anti-Semitic brand of Lutheran Christianity was widespread, whereas the eastern parts of Denmark had primarily a different type of Lutheranism, which was rather philo-Semitic. Most of the Danish Jews lived in the Copenhagen area. Copenhagen is Danish for Copenhagen, and that is the capital. And about 1/3 of the 4 million people who lived in Denmark were living in the capital area. And this is also where we find the large majority of the Jews had settled in this area, which, again, as you can see, was close to Sweden. Sweden is here. Helsingborg, Malmö, Lund, Göteborg. So we're talking about a sealift operation that brought Jews from this side to this side of what is called the Sound of the Øresund, an international water which is narrow but has a lot of current because it's one of the only 3 waters leading into the Baltic Sea. And on this map of just the eastern part of Denmark, you can see a number of white spots, which all represent points of debarkation during October 43, and on the Swedish side, points of where Jews were landing. So this is not a complete map, and nobody can make a complete map these days because the whole operation has not been completely mapped and analyzed in detail. Let me move to this picture. So we are back with Eastern Denmark, with the Copenhagen area. At that time, there was no bridge, no highway connecting Denmark and Sweden, only water. And this is actually my neighborhood. This is when I go out my door and around the corner, this is what I see. The Christianshavn Channel, one of many channels in the Copenhagen harbor areas. And some of the boats that are lying here could have participated in the rescue because they're old enough, they're like more than 100 years old. And we know for sure that from Christianshavn Channel, there were quite a few transports of Jews, clandestine transports to Sweden. From a small channel which goes down this way, one very important boat was operating, which I'm going to talk to you about. So let us start by getting, you say, like the greater picture straight. The Nazi persecution of the Jews started as soon as the Nazis got into power. And don't forget, the Nazis got into power by democratic means. They had about 35% of the votes at the last free elections in Weimar Germany, and then allied themselves with conservative parties to get enough votes that Hitler could be appointed chancellor, prime minister of Germany. And once he had gotten that position, the Nazis did not intend to ever give power away again, no matter what happened. So they started, and this is widely known, an assault on all democratic institutions, especially in the beginning, an assault on the labor movement, socialists, communists, trade union activists, and so on and so forth, because that was where the primary opposition was expected. At the same time, the discrimination of Jews begins right from the very start. In April 1933, we have a national boycott of Jewish shops and Jewish offices and so on and so forth. Not lasting for long, but telling every Jewish person in the country that from now on you are going to be hunted. And many Jews reacted to the menace by leaving the country. Quite a few ended up in the United States, but the United States, like every other country, including Denmark, reacted to the oppression and this wave of refugees by kind of trying to hold back the new immigrants and strengthening their laws against immigration. So it was very difficult for Jews to find a place to immigrate to. The Nuremberg racial laws in 1935 were, of course, defined for the first time who are actually considered Jewish by the Nazis, and which are their rights, institutionalizing kind of a second-hand type of citizenship that was more or less only that the Jewish citizens would only have obligations but no rights in German society. And in the course of time, Nuremberg racial laws were applied to every single country under German rule except for Denmark. In 1938, Austria joins Germany, and we have a very strong radicalization of anti-Jewish violence, also with the climax in the so-called Crystal Night. And then from the German attack on Poland in 1939, another radicalization follows, and the first mass murders of Jews commence. This, again, in 1941, we have a new radicalization as Germany attacks the Soviet Union, which was considered by the Nazis as their primary goal, to kind of wipe out communism from the face of the earth. And the Nazis considered communism and Jewry as being like more or less the same. So this is the start of like systematic massacres. This is the start of total physical annihilation of Jews in the summer of 1941. And if we turn to Denmark and see, we can see that, of course, in the 30s, Denmark was a sovereign country and had to react to the refugee wave. Some refugees were taken in, but the laws got very strict and it became difficult to enter. That changed in 38, 39, where Denmark agreed to take in young people from Germany, from Austria, and also from German-occupied Czechoslovakia, who were traveling without their parents. The parents couldn't get out anymore, but it was still possible to send young people, supposedly to train them as agricultural students for eventually immigrating to what would in the future become Israel. One such young agricultural student actually stayed with my grandfather's family, was raised like for more or less a year with my mother and her siblings. And this is one of the reasons how I got interested in this whole issue in the first place. Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany on April 9th, 1940. So, the Danish politic had to adjust to that fact. Denmark was a very weak country, militarily speaking, and Germany was strong. And the Danes decided there's no reason, there's no idea in fighting the Germans. So we just have to protest the fact that we have been occupied, and then kind of do business with the Germans, because there was no chance of doing business with the other side anymore. But the Germans gave guarantees to the Danes, a guarantee of the Danish sovereignty. Denmark would still function as a normal state with its own institutions. And remember, those institutions were democratic institutions. So the same power that wiped out democracy in Germany actually agreed that democratic institutions could continue in Denmark. You can see, as the other side of the equation, Denmark started delivering agricultural goods. Danish agriculture was very strong in those days and very efficient, and eventually also industrial products and ships. Then Denmark had a very strong shipbuilding industry. So Denmark was kind of contributing to the German war efforts by delivering civilian products mostly. In the beginning, most Danish citizens agreed to this policy, which was also carried by a wide majority of the Danish parliament, stretching from the socialists to the conservatives, over the liberals, which had like two parties. So everybody was more or less in agreement about cooperating with the Germans, but also keeping them out in a stretched hand, so to speak. But eventually, the situation for the Germans changed. In 1943, we know that they lost the Battle of Stalingrad, and in the summer, Hamburg was more or less wiped out. This is the second largest city of Germany, and one of the largest cities in Europe, was wiped out by Allied bombardments. The British would bomb in the nights, the Americans would bomb in the day, and Danish citizens got a lot of information about this, because at that time there were many Danish workers in Hamburg who fled the disaster to Denmark and could tell the stories, which became available to the Danish public outside of the German censorship. So radicalization, one more element of the radicalization of a will to resist is being seen in 43. And one more element is the fact that the Jews in Warsaw started resisting and put up the first armed uprising against the Germans as the Germans tried to wipe them out. This became known in Denmark through the illegal press, which was had widespread circulation in these days, and also contributed. Somebody was doing something, somebody was fighting back. And this inspired Danish resistance also to radical action against German targets in the course of August 1943. We talk about the August uprising. And in the end, the Danish government was presented by the Germans with an ultimatum, also demanding of them to agree to the reintroduction of death penalty. It has been considered a very big civilizatory step for the Denmark to abandon death penalty back in the 20s. And this was one of the three elements of politics that the Danish were not willing to compromise on. No death penalty. Also, no direct participation of Danish troops on the German side. Denmark would be neutral and not become part of the active warfare. And the third element was the idea that no racial laws, no Nuremberg laws should be introduced in Denmark, that anti-Semitic laws would not be tolerated by the government. But in the end of August, the government resigns, and the Germans immediately strike down on the Danes. Werner Best, who was the head of German administration, had a long history of being the operations. What can you say? The chief of operations of the Gestapo, and he was also the person who, in France, had invented a special system punishing the French for acts of resistance by deporting Jews to Auschwitz. He tries to lift this mechanism to Denmark, punishing the Danes for the resistance by punishing the Jews, by deporting the Jews. In September, in the beginning of September, he suggests to Berlin, we should deport the Jews now, finally. So far, the Danish government has been against it, but there's no Danish government anymore. So let's deport the Jews. And of course, Adolf Hitler approved of this immediately. But then in the course of September 1943, Werner Best realizes that the striking down on the Danish Jews is going to be very counterproductive. Danes were protective of the Jews, and this was quite a widespread attitude. And in the course of September, the heads of civil service kind of agreed that they might continue cooperating with the Germans without the political government on top of this arrangement. Sorry, but that the cooperation might go on a lower flame, and the Germans, Werner Best, wanted that to happen. So in the end, after having gotten his go-ahead from Adolf Hitler to deport the Jews, he also slips out a warning through a German agent, a secret agent, Georg Duckwitz, this guy, who addresses a leading social democratic politician, Hans Hiltoft, and warns him in 3 days there is going to be an action taken against the Jews. Hans Hiltoft immediately communicates this to the head of the Jewish community, who doesn't believe him and who doesn't act on it. And because of this, Hans Hiltoft proceeds to Rabbi Marcus Melchior, who is easily convinced that it is the truth. This assault on the Jews is going to take place on the 1st of October, the so-called Judenaktion. So the Jews get 2 or 3 days to get into hiding, and this is what they do, and they show an admirable degree of composure and also of what can you say, like fantasy in developing strategies of getting away. And they're able to do this also because wide layers of Danish society agrees to help them, or simply volunteers as helpers, even without being asked directly. Many people turn to the Jews and say, "Do you need help? Can we do something?" Not everybody manages to get away, so 470 end up in Theresienstadt, the ghetto near to Prague, and this is where they are being kept until the liberation, and where 53 of them die, mostly of hunger, starvation, and diseases. Since we are talking in a library setting, I'd just like to present to you the like 3 major works on these events. The doctoral dissertation of Israeli historian Levi Yachil, published way back in 1967, is still the magisterial work on this. But Bo Lidegaard, a Danish historian, in 2013 also published a book in English, which gives us a lot of insight in especially at the grassroots level of what happened. Leo Goldberger, a professor of psychology at New York University, published in 1987 this volume about not only the rescue, but also interpretations. Why was it that the Danes were willing to save Jews, whereas most of the populations of the rest of Europe didn't want that? And I'm also mentioning here a brochure which will come out again, which was published in 1993, first time, and then in 2010, and now is being published in a third printing in 2023, written by me for the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because clearly public diplomacy knows that if there's anything that people know about Denmark, Danish history, well, it might be the Vikings, but we share the Vikings with the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Icelanders. So it is the October 43 events that are the events that people will know if they know anything about Danish history. The Holocaust cost the lives of 6 million Jews, this we all know, and we also know that this was more than half of the Jews who lived in Europe, which again was more than half of the Jews who lived on the face of the earth. The Wannsee Conference Protocol, a statistics of the perpetrators, had the number 11 million, and this shows us the scope of the destruction that was intended by the Nazis. We can see, I have the numbers from Denmark, which are small and very small. And this is, of course, you could easily say, well, okay, so what does this matter? An example of so few people in such a large number. 5,600 Jews is the number that the Wannsee Conference, Adolf Eichmann's bureaucrats, had listed. In fact, there were more, but one of the reasons that 7,600 Jewish refugees from Denmark ended up in Sweden was also the fact that about 1,500 Jewish refugees have to be taken into account. 470, as I said, were deported to Theresienstadt. The total loss of Jewish lives due to Nazi persecution in Denmark was 116. And we also have a few hundred Jews who actually survived in Denmark, most of them young children who were left with non-Jewish family or friends or neighbors, or also in orphanages because their parents didn't dare take them across on the dangerous crossing to Sweden. If we take a general European stance, we can see that Denmark is on the very lowest edge of as far as Jewish losses is concerned. And we have Yugoslavia, the Holland, and Lithuania with more than 90% death toll on the other end of the scale. So this is the reason why so many people know about Denmark, we could really say. The rescue was largely successful. And it's very important for me to emphasize the fact that the first people who actually turned active in the rescue were the Jews themselves. Very first thing is to try to find out the information that you're getting, the warning that you're getting. Can you believe it? Or is this misinformation planted by the Nazis, maybe planted in order to create panic amongst the Jews, which then would present the Germans with the pretense to strike down on the Jews? So would a reaction actually cause a disaster that was still not a fact? But most Jews were very easy to convince or convince themselves that this that the danger was real, and that they had to act, and that they had to act immediately. And this is one very important factor. Leaving their homes, finding places to hide, is very important. The reasons for the successful rescue. Well, we can talk about politics. The August uprising not only caused the Germans to attempt to deport the Jews, but it also created and emphasized and augmented the anti-Nazi, anti-German, and anti-collaborationist mood in the Danish society. So at this time, many Danes thought that it is time to give the Germans a blow to the nose. And it might be the last time that we get the chance, because there was a very optimistic feeling in Denmark that the Germans were about to lose the war. There were reasons for this: the capitulation of Italy, the Hamburg firestorm, as I mentioned, Stalingrad, and other events too. And also the fact that on the Danish west coast, the German military was showing signs of panic, having fears that an Allied invasion on the European continent might take place on Denmark's western coast. Timing is an important. Okay, so the August uprising not only creates this anti-Nazi, anti-German, anti-collaborationist mood, but it also creates a will to act in the Danish population. Timing is important. The policy of collaboration or cooperation, both words can be used, and they don't have exactly the same connotations, but still, I guess you know what I mean. This policy had one precious time. It had caused the postponement of persecution. The Germans, first time already in 1940, they turned to the Danes suggesting anti-Jewish laws, and the Danes said no. This happened again in 41. This happened again in 42, and every time the Danish government said no way, and considered the protection of this very small minority a crucial element of protecting the moral order and the political order of Danish society. So persecution strikes late in Denmark, at a time where way more than half of the French Jews had already been deported, Dutch Jews too. 1 year later than the deportation of the Norwegian Jews, who were taken to Auschwitz, and where only 31 out of close to 800 survived. The fact that the persecution in Denmark started as late as in October 43 actually provided the Jews with a long period of a relatively normal life, and also better chances to survive. Germany was in trouble. I've mentioned the reasons. And then we have the geographic factor. If you think back to the maps I showed you, the concentration of Danish Jews in the larger Copenhagen area, and the fact that many Danish Jews belonged to the middle or upper classes and had summer houses at the beaches, which could be used for hiding, for instance, but primarily, of course, the fact that Sweden was very close. But between Denmark and Sweden were waters that were in October not that easy to cross because of the weather, because of storms, because of heavy rainfalls, and so on and so forth. And so there was a substantial danger involved in the illegal sealift operation. Another aspect, another element that explains why of course, we need to also to include the fact that Sweden decided to accept the refugees from Denmark in. Sweden, in the beginning of World War II, had a very close cooperation with the Germans. Sweden was neutral, but they did deliver large amounts of iron ore to this German armaments industry, and they also permitted German troops to travel via Sweden to the Eastern Front in Finland, and so on and so forth, to the northern part of Norway, where fighting was going on, and so on and so forth. But in 1943, the Swedes were clearly wanting to change sides and become neutral with a leaning to the Allied side. So the Swedes decided not only to accept the refugees in, and this is the first massive refugee movement from Denmark to Sweden during the war. After that, many non-Jews also had to flee. People who were related to the resistance movement and so on and so forth. But so Sweden decided to accept the Danish refugees, the Danish Jewish refugees in, and also to make it public. And the fact that it was made public on Swedish radio, which was listened a lot to in Denmark, convinced also Jews who were skeptical about like the reality of persecution that actually now they had to get away. And a very important aspect of or reason for the successful rescue, of course, are the values in the non-Jewish Danish population. We see during World War II, during the occupation, a rise in nationalism, in anti-German sentiments, and so on and so forth. And of course, helping Jews, helping those whom the Germans defined as enemies, could be seen as a statement of anti-Germanness, a statement of Danish national identity. We also have an aspect of Christian ethics involved. The ethics of mercy, the idea that one should care for one's neighbor, and that especially one should care for the weak, the weakest part. And Christianity was, you could say, it was a very strong element in Danish culture, and in Denmark it was a very homogeneous type of Christianity, very different from Holland, where you had Catholics and Protestants, and they couldn't stand each other and they could not work together. In Denmark, like almost everybody was a Protestant, but there were slightly different brands of Protestantism or Lutheranism. And as I mentioned before, the Philo-Semitic, so-called Grundtvigian branch of Christianity was the strongest, especially in the areas of Denmark where most of the Jews who needed help were living. So Christian ethics are part of this, and we see during the German manhunt that the churches protest against the manhunt and strongly emphasizes that it is a religious obligation to help the Jews against persecution. Another very important aspect of Danish societies in those days was socialism. The Socialist Party had almost 50% of the votes during the elections in the 30s and was very well organized. And the socialist ethic was an ethics of solidarity, internationalism, and solidarity. So internationalism means you do not just help those Jews who are Danish citizens, you help everyone, and you especially help the refugees who are the ones who already fled Nazi dictatorship once. And solidarity means, of course, you will stand up for everyone, and you will especially stand up for the weakest. Anti-Semitism did exist in Denmark in those days. In the 19th century, it was rather strong, not by far, not less strong than in most of the other European countries. But in the course of the 20th century, it had been fought by the socialists and also eventually by conservatives and liberals. So in the course of time, at the time of the occupation, anti-Semitism was being very closely associated with being pro-German and being pro-Nazi, and was somewhere where ordinary Danes wouldn't go anymore. A part of the reason is the strong integration of Danish Jews, many of whom decided to marry non-Jews, many of whom decided to either leave any kind of religious belief or even like join Christian beliefs, mostly in connection with intermarriage. So we had a small and well-integrated minority and confronted with a rather weak type of anti-Semitism. When it comes to the conduct of the rescue, I mean, once the idea we need to help is there, you also have to know how to do it. Danish society had a training in, you could say, grassroots democracy ever since the 19th century, ever since the introduction in 1849 of the democratic order of society, because the peasants, the smallholders, were organized in cooperatives, and these cooperatives were like functioned as a training in day-to-day democratic decision-making, self-organized decision-making. And we had the same situation in the labor movement. The Danish labor market was very well organized, and practically very few workers were not organized. And the labor movement also operated along these basic democratic structures or ideas, which means that wide layers of Danish societies at the bottom and the middle class had this training in self-organization, which was so helpful at the time when the Germans struck against the Jews, because at that time government was not there anymore to tell them what to do, so they had to find out themselves. And the values helped them to find out what, and this training in basic democratic structures helped them find out how. The boat is a powerful metaphor and very suitable for, of course, our story about the Danish rescue. Now, this picture is a reconstruction, and most of the pictures, most of the photos that we have of boats with Jews on them are actually reconstructions. Of course, who would take the risk of making photos during the actual clandestine sealift operation? That would be a security risk very strongly. So what does this metaphor tell us? It tells us about the escape across the water, which leaves no traces. Once you're across, nobody can see you. No bloodhound can trace you down. So there's this element of hope and this element of, like, once you're through, you're through. It's not like hiding in forests in Lithuania or Poland, where the bloodhounds can be after you for years and years. But we have also connected with the boat as a metaphor, and of course boats were used, and most of the boats were small boats or medium-sized boats. The connotation of frailty, of danger. Imagine that a German Navy vessel puts its searchlight on a boat like this one. I mean, you will be at their power. You would be delivered. And there's also the delivery to the elements, and the waters of the inner Danish waters are not that dangerous. It's nothing near the British Channel, for instance. But still, in October we have storms, and we also have a population, a Jewish, mostly urban population, which is not used to traveling at sea, and especially not in small boats. So this element of perceived but also real danger is important. We also have the symbol of all in one boat. Rich and poor come together during these crossings. Members of some of the richest families of Denmark are aboard boats where some of the schnorrers are also beggars, people who are living outside of society. And we have the connotation, of course, of Noah's Ark, of rescue back from biblical times. So here's one boat that made it. Photographed a few days after the crossing in Rebroadcast in Sweden, and I put in a lollipop on that spot. Four Jewish siblings got across, and their aunt was also aboard, and a fisherman who was the one who actually did most of the rowing. They got safe across. It took some time, and danger was imminent as one of the two oars broke in the middle of the water. So it was very difficult to maneuver the boat to the shore. A few days after their landing on the beach at Rev, they went back to this place and took this triumphant picture. Look, we're safe. Look, we made it. To send it to their father, who had come across at another time and another place, and they wanted him to know that they were safe, and they wanted to document this. Another boat, which you might be able to go and visit at the US National Maritime Museum at Mystic Seaport, because that's where it's located these days. It's the property of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and the exhibition that Robin was mentioning to you, which I'm also, where I'm part of the team, is actually building an exhibition around that particular boat. It was built like a fishing cutter, typical one, but it never served as one because it was employed by the Danish boys service, and was sailing provisions to a lighthouse which was located in mid-sea between Denmark and Sweden in the Øresund Strait, where people were surveying the ship movements of that important sea road. And this boat never actually did any fishing, but it did rescue as much as probably 300 Jews to Sweden during October 43. A young woman who loved the sea and used to go out sailing on that boat and also on other boats, Henny Sinning Sunner, formed a resistance group, and her father was the head of that particular service of Danish service, and she just told him it might be that Gerda, which is the name of the boat, will do some unusual travels in the coming days and weeks. And he said, well, it's okay with me as long as you don't bring yourself into danger. But of course there was danger, and nothing happened during those days, but shortly after the rescue of the Danish Jews, I mean, Henny and her crowd kept on transporting other refugees and had eventually to flee to Sweden themselves. And this particular boat, Gerda 3, operated out of Christianshavn's Canal, which is right outside from where I'm speaking at this very moment. Christianshavn's Canal is here in the center of Copenhagen. And another boat, which is still in the water and still in Danish waters, was located in Dragør. So here you have the Copenhagen International Airport today. And south of it, there's a small fishing village called Dragør, which is where this boat operated, Elizabeth. And that was the fishing boat. You can see it's similar to Gerda, but this one was a fishing boat from the very beginning and operated by a skipper by the name of Einar Larsen. And he and his crew took some 70 Jews to Sweden from Dragør during October, and still in November they still were able to find refugees that needed transportation. Another boat can be seen at the Danish Resistance Museum in the exhibition there. It is the property of the Danish National Museum, Ternen. That's the name of a bird, a special bird, kind of a seagull. Sorry, an open, large dinghy type fishing boat, also made for fishing eels actually. But it had a pretty strong petrol engine in it. And then, as you can see here, it also had sails just to help save fuels once you are out on the open waters. This boat was bought by two Jewish families and ferried those families to Sweden. And this is the first case that I'm going to make you acquainted with. I'm using the Safe Haven database and website, which was originally constructed by the Danish Jewish Museum and is being maintained by them. As an introduction, and I want to introduce you to the wonderful possibilities of doing like micro level research on this database. You can, so to speak, visit the Danish October 43 events from your home computer by way of this website address. As you can see, I did a search for you, Abraham Steinbock, a young man at this time of 24 years, and he sails from Korea. That's not true. That is pointing to one of the difficulties of the database, that not all informations are exact. There was actually 15 miles from Korea to Lund, which is a very small fisherman's village, from where this boat was actually sailing. But you can see, when did it happen? On the 3rd of October 1943. That is, the German strike against the Jews is the night between the 1st and the 2nd. So we are right in the aftermath of the first German police action. And they land at Skanör, which is on the Swedish coast, of course. And then we have a document that can be clicked on, and you will proceed to a Swedish police investigation report made in Malmö on the day of arrival. And let us take a look at Abraham Steinbock. He was a student of medicine at Copenhagen University in those days, and it was a co-student who warned him that he shouldn't be in the lecture, but he should speed home and warn his family about what was going to happen. He was born in Nyhavn in Copenhagen, which was in those days a horrible, very poor, like ghetto-like area of Copenhagen. And as you can see, he lived to become a very old man, and he settled eventually, after having been a refugee in Sweden, coming back and finishing his medical degree in Denmark. He settled in Sweden and married in Sweden and had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. In the picture in the middle, you see Abraham attending Hebrew school. His family was religious, practicing Jews, which is not the fact for the majority of Danish Jews, actually. But Abraham's family had immigrated from what was then Russia in the time of his parents. So they had brought the Jewish culture of the so-called Eastern Jews along to Denmark. But you already see his father was a furniture maker and had a small shop and workshop in another very poor neighborhood of Copenhagen, where people basically had to buy every piece of furniture by dividing payments and stretching them over years. But you can see the upward mobility tendency already that Abraham is considered valuable enough for the family to study medicine, and of course intelligent enough to do so. The flight of the Steinbock family on October 5th. This is another inaccuracy in the Swedish document. It states the landing as having been on October 3rd, but actually it was 2 days later. So they start out in Copenhagen, Nørrebro, the poorest part of Copenhagen, a workers' neighborhood, and then they decide to go south. Most Danish Jews would go north because the northern part of Zealand was the part that they would know from summer holidays. Many had cottages there, so they had kind of contacts to the Gentile populations of these areas. And Abraham was thinking, well, if everybody else is going to the north, it's probably safer to go to the south. He had no contacts, neither in the north nor in the south. So he and his brother, who was just a young guy working with his father in the family business, a truck driver actually, and they take their bicycles and they go along the coast to Korea, where they knew somebody, and they had the possibility of sleeping over in the night and then starting their search by going to all the various fishermen's villages on this part of Denmark, and eventually ending up in Lund. In Lund, they meet a fisherman who is willing to provide them with a boat. He wants to sell it. It is expensive, but they have the luck that on the road, practically on the road, they met somebody on a bicycle who was also looking for transportation for Jews, a non-Jew who was helping another Jewish family, and eventually is able to bring up the money. And the money was an issue, and it was a great deal of money that had to be brought up in order to buy that boat. Now, for Jews, it's kind of, you can say, paradoxical that this particular boat had been out eel fishing. So in the cargo hold, there were about 700 kilos of live eel that could not be unloaded. So they had to buy the boat and the eel and get across with this non-kosher fish to Sweden. They managed to. Abraham had done some sailing as a student, but just like small sail ships. So he knew about navigation, and he trusted himself to be able to do the crossing to Sweden. And actually, he was able to. So but he had some help, and I'll get back to that. Let's see the police interrogation report as Abraham is questioned by the Swedish police on October 5th, 1943, interrogated. Every adult refugee, Jewish or non-Jewish, would be interrogated because the Swedish had fears that the Germans might use this refugee movement to also smuggle in spies in Sweden. So here you have the police report, which is schematical, and I have enlarged some of it. So arrival in the night. It was a very dramatic crossing because at one point a German warship came very close, but did not discover the boat as they stopped the engine and tried to keep completely calm and keep out the searchlight, and they managed to, but it was very dramatic, and this fear of being taken, arrested out in the middle of the water, stayed with him forever. So he is bringing a little bit of money with him because all that he had and that the family had been used to buy the boat. This is, of course, an element of Jewish agency. You see, so we need a boat, so we buy one. And then we operate it ourselves. But he also did have some help, actually, in that. You can see the Swedish constable who's signing the report, and basically, so this is what we know about the landing. And we also know that they come from Lund, close to Korea, and this is the reason why there's a mistake in the database, because Korea is not close according to Danish ideas, but it's close in the eyes of a Swedish policeman who has a lot to do with making these reports at the time of the events. Abraham Steinbock, his brother Raphael, his father Salman, and his mother Bertha are aboard, and also the family Altermann, a three-headed family, Leibko Altermann, Doba Altermann, his wife, and the son Sami. And Sami was a dentist, and Leibko Altermann was an insurance broker who lived in a posh neighborhood in Copenhagen called Frederiksberg, and those were and it was the Altamans who actually provided the money with which Abraham Steinbock was able to purchase the boat. Now, on the crossing, 2 more people were participating. Bent Hove, a young fisherman, 19 years old, and Knud Nørgaard, a Danish policeman. The policeman, it was typical that the Danish police were aiding the Jews. They did not help the Germans. They were not allowed to help the Germans. And if they were in cases where they were asked to provide help, they said, no, we can't do that. We're not allowed to. You have to do that yourself. Not get involved. But Knud Nørgaard kind of thought that this is the chance to get away from them. And it's not clear what his motives really were. But we know about the motives of Bent Hove, who as a young person, a young man, unmarried, from the neighborhood, was expecting that in the situation of German radicalization, the Germans might turn to conscription of forced labor. So he might end up in Germany. Now, the Germans didn't do that, but his fears were real and his fears were justified. So he decides, and this is what he tells the police, that as he arrives, he decides to use this opportunity. He can help Abraham sail the boat. He knows about the boat, he knows about the engine, and they actually have an engine breakdown in the middle of the water, which is solved by those two together with Knud Nørgaard. So a good thing that he was along, but he also has a personal motive for getting across to Sweden. And it is not just adventure or anything like this. This is what Lund looked like a couple of years ago at around the time of night when they would sail out, because they had to do the sailing in the cover, under the cover of darkness. Very small harbor. There was a small German detachment actually supposed, of course, to guard and make observations and guard the harbor, but these guys were mostly consumed with gambling in their quarters at this time, and the local people knew about them and knew at which time it would be safe to take the Jews down to the boat and have the boat go out, of course, without turning the engine on, because that would certainly alarm the Germans. What happened to Bent Hove? Well, here we have his interrogation, and he's a fisherman, and he was afraid, as I said, he was afraid that there might be conscription of forced labor, and he also was not satisfied with the occupational power. So he states an anti-German motive. What happened to him? Well, the Danish Jews who came to Sweden were taken to refugee camps, but then very, very quickly they also were allowed to kind of integrate into the larger Swedish society. And many of them had family connections across the Danish-Swedish border and were able to get back into business, or the younger children that schools were put up in order for them to study in Danish and so on and so forth. Bent Hove, being a non-Jew and being a young person, was sent into the forest to do logging. And he didn't like that. He was a maritime person. He was somebody who was used to sailing, to fishing. So he volunteered for to sail on a German ship. A Swedish ship that would go to Germany and pick up coal for the Swedish for the Swedish market. And on the second trip, we do have his visa application where he is writing to the Swedish authority, I want a visum so that I can leave the ship when we are hitting Swedish harbors and not have to stay aboard. But his career as a Swedish seaman was very short. in 1944, in August, this ship ran onto a mine, and he lost his life. The ship went down, he drowned. And this is the memorial stone that is placed in the tiny, tiny village from where he came. Also stating, on the night to October 3rd, 1943, he sailed refugees to Sweden. Thank you for what you did. Another case, Marcus Melchior, I mentioned him to you. Sorry. Marcus Melchior was one of the rabbis of Copenhagen Synagogue. The chief rabbi was taken hostage on August 29 and brought to an internment camp. So he wasn't available. And Marcus Melchior, who sort of was the second rabbi in command, did the services as the chief rabbi was away. He had at that time 3 children. One of them later also became the chief rabbi of Denmark. And his grandson is the present chief rabbi of Denmark. And I just saw him today at a commemoration at the Jewish cemetery 2 hours ago. Rabbi Marcus Melchior and his family came across on a very dramatic crossing, which took more than 14 hours. The water doesn't have the same distance from Denmark to Sweden everywhere, as you saw on the map. And they were leaving from a place very down in the furthest south of Denmark, where the distance is very long. And the fisherman with whom they were coming across was what we call a coast fisher, somebody who always does his fishing very close to the coast, has his nets along the coast. So he wasn't used to being out on waters where he couldn't see land. And he almost landed in Sweden, in Germany, before it was clear to the refugees and himself that he was heading in the wrong direction. And then, of course, he turned around and eventually ended up in Sweden, using the last drops of petrol that he had in his tank. Marcus Melchior and his family arrived in an unknown harbor, because there was no harbor there; it was a beach. And this is the visa application of the rabbi made at the time when he realizes we're not going to get back to Denmark. We have to have a visa. I have to start working. I have to, as a rabbi or whatever, in order to support my family. And he notes in this visa application, I do intend, as soon as the situation in Denmark allows me to return to Denmark. So I'm not an immigrant. I'm a refugee. Please give me the visa. And he got it, and he got to function as the chief rabbi of the Danish refugees in Sweden. This is Hesnes. This is from where the Melchior family was taken across, and all the way to the backside of the Swedish peninsula, which was yes. The last person I'm going to introduce you to, we also need some time for discussion, I assume, is Erna Wachenheimer. Erna Wachenheimer escaped from, well, the records don't tell us which harbor, already on September 30th. Now, you remember the warning was communicated to specific synagogue goers on the day before. So it is very early that Erna decides to go across to Sweden. Probably she didn't even get the warning before she decided this. And why was that? Probably there's many things that we don't know about Erna Wachenheimer, but she was a middle-aged woman who had lived in a prosperous German Jewish family. In the course of the reign of the Nazis, the family have lost their family business in a small city called Biebesheim am Rhein, and moved to Frankfurt first, and then they were able to flee to Sweden, which is where her husband, Isaac Goldonkel Wachenheimer. Goldonkel was his nickname, and obviously he was kind of the rich guy in the family, the one that everybody would turn to if they were in dire straits. But Isaac died at the age of 70 in Copenhagen in 1940, leaving Erna Wachenheimer, born Sichel, as a widow. Now, you have a social deroute from living under very secure conditions in post-war, like interwar Germany, to becoming, what is it that she's becoming? She becomes a maid in Sweden. So important is that coming from Germany, knowing the Nazis' intentions, knowing the way the Nazis think about the Jews and the actions they take against the Jews, she doesn't need much. She doesn't need much warning in order to decide to flee again. Maybe, probably, nobody warned her. She just acted out of her own feel of the situation. She gets across to Sweden, and we have this application for visa, which reveals that at this time she is working as a maid. Imagine this is a woman in her 40s, working as a maid with the Jewish family in Malmö. The Jewish family, of course, doing her a favor by providing her a job. But imagine the situation and the emotions of a woman like this who has been through who has twice been forced to flee and having been torn out of a very secure and prosperous existence and reduced to being made in somebody else's household. I think these are examples of what this database and what the Swedish police records and the Swedish immigration records can give us, like glimpses of individual destinies in the middle of this sealift operation, this rescue operation. To conclude about the database, the data is diverse, uneven, incomplete. We don't have data on all the individuals. As you probably remember, I said that in 1944, 7,600 Danish Jewish refugees lived in Sweden. We only have the records of some 6,300. And typical, there's also information which is not only unreliable but untruthful, because some Jews, especially those who were refugees from Denmark, from Germany, from Austria, from Czechoslovakia, had a fear of the Swedish. They had a fear of any police. They did not want to volunteer information, or they would volunteer information that was faulty in order to cover their tracks. Danish Jews were more naive or less suspicious about this. And Danish Jews and foreign Jews at this time could still have uncertainty about the real Swedish position, because the change of Swedish politics from a pro-German to a pro-Allied neutrality was so new that they could only know if they were very, very well informed. The information contained in the documents and in the database, of course, need contextualization. They can't stand for themselves. They are places from where you can start searching, also searching for family, of course. And of course, having a database of the rescued reproduces a focus that has traditionally in the Danish story been on the rescued, and provided some invisibility to those who were not rescued, who perished during the flight, or who got caught and ended up in Theresienstadt. The advantages of this database, I mean, try to go look for family and acquaintances and people you know, or people whose names you know, and you get some insights into individual flight stories. You will get also, in some cases, verification, but do not despair if you don't find verification, because some of the information is not completely reliable. We have the documents of a large number of refugees, also non-Jewish refugees, like, for instance, Bent Hove, who ended up dying in this war-related ship accident, but we don't have the records of all. We will also be able very often to find out who was along on a particular boat. So if you know somebody who got across, it would be possible to find out who else was aboard that same boat. In many cases, that's possible. And we can see some patterns. When did the Jews get across? When did which kind of Jews get across? When did the rich Jews, the poor Jews, those in the middle, the Danish Jews, the German refugees, and so on and so forth? And it is possible to reconstruct, but that demands a lot of work, some elements of the rescue networks behind the sealift operation. And I guess these networks were non-Jewish. An estimate, which is my estimate, is that more than 100,000 Danes actually participated in one role or another, large or small, in the rescue. Earlier estimates are much lower, but we can also sort of trace down at least some of the Jewish networks that were functioning, which were often family networks, but also professional networks and networks of neighborhood, or networks of a religious nature, people who knew each other from one of the two synagogues of Copenhagen, the conservative synagogue or the ultra-Orthodox synagogue. This is also possible. So it's a wonderful material to browse through, and with the help of some of the literature that's available in English, and also with the help of Shoah Foundation interviews, which have been made available recently on the internet with life story interviews with Jews who fled from Denmark, it is possible to piece together a much fuller picture of what happened during those days than we used to have. And I guess this is where I start for now, and just to leave a little time for the questions that you might have. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Straede. Before we start answering questions, do you want to tell us a little bit about the museum and the display that you're planning for October?
Yes, I'd be pleased to. I assume that, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, is in your neighborhood practically. It's just across the Hudson River in Battery Park. And many of you who are listening in might already know it. We are making an exhibition which is targeting young children from the age of, like, say, 10 and upwards, children and teenagers. It's our primary target group. Also their educators, of course, also their parents, their grandparents, whoever would like to go to a museum with children. And the exhibition is about the Danish rescue. We call it Courage to Act because the museum is drawing some, you can say, emotional and ethical learnings from the story that I just told you about. So the exhibition is basically, well, it's basically an attempt to try to tell the story about the Holocaust by addressing one of the lighter moments in the Holocaust. In order for it not to be too dull, too scary for children, but still make it possible to create kind of a space where they can relate to some of the issues of the Holocaust, some of the basic issues, and also probably, I hope, a space of conversation across generations about what happened. And this can open up for family history. Many New York families, many New Jersey families have a Holocaust history, which of course children are confronted with, or they hear about it, and so on and so forth. This is the way that it's possible to go to this exhibition, learn about the Danish experience, and then relate it to whatever is known in the family, in the community where they live. So we are reconstructing part of the Gerda. We are reconstructing sceneries from Copenhagen, from downtown Copenhagen, and we are presenting composite characters as well as real persons, their stories, focusing on particular small number of persons who took choices during this time. You could say moral choices, who decided to do something about the persecution that was tumbling down upon the Jews and upon Danish society.
So I'm just looking, I just want to remind everybody they can chat in any questions that they have. Somebody is asking, why did Werner Best tip off the Jews?
A very good question, and one that really demands a very long and complicated answer, but I'll spare you of that. Werner Best was known to be an ardent anti-Semite and somebody who also participated in putting up the apparatus of annihilation. So it's kind of a paradox that in Denmark he turned to a more moderate politics. There's one good reason for this, which is he was so much a Nazi fundamentalist that he considered like all German politics should be guided by the principle of race. And the Danes were considered to being an Aryan people, very close to the Germans. And in order to keep the Danes satisfied, keep the Danes happy, and make them eventually merge into the larger German Reich, Werner Best would use a soft hand on the Danes. Now, he had been in Denmark for 1.5 years at the time, and he had understood that the Danes were very protective of the Jews. So he said, okay, so we want to annihilate them at one point, but let's just wait until the right moment has come. The right moment seems to him to have come as the government resigns, and there's a new situation of complete German rule. So this is the time. And it's also urgent to strike down on the Jews because he needs to show a firm hand to the Danes now and punish them for the resistance. So he decides to ask for Hitler's permission to deport the Jews, and of course he gets the permissions right away. And then it takes some time to build up the police force that is needed, because it wasn't planned. It was not something that had been expected. And in that time, it turns out that the Danish heads of civil service agree to continuing the cooperation that had functioned until August 29, and go back into a mode where Denmark would still also in 44 deliver agricultural goods to Germany, deliver industrial goods, and so on and so forth. And actually on October 1st, 1943, the Danish-German trade agreement for 1944 is signed. just hours before the police action is taken against the Jews. But at this time, Werner Best realizes that if I start a manhunt throughout every Danish village, throughout every Danish farm, which is supposed to deliver the agricultural goods, people will simply not accept that. We will have an uproar in the population, and we will have a complete breakdown of the cooperation that he is expecting to reinstall. And for this reason, he sort of whispers into the ear of this German secret agent, Duckwitz, that this is going to happen. And Duckwitz immediately knows what he means and goes to the socialist leaders. Duckwitz was as kind of an agent who was supposed to be friendly with the Social Democratic Party, which was the largest single political party of the country. In order to know what they were doing, what they were thinking, he was keeping a friendly facade towards them. So he could warn them, and he could know and he could count on the fact that once they're warned, somebody will make sure they disappear. And at the time, when the Jews have gotten across to Sweden, most of them, and the rest, the 470, have been deported, he writes to Berlin, to Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of this deportation, as well as the other deportations in Europe, and writes them, so we've achieved our goal. There are no Jews left in Denmark. And of course, being a Nazi fundamentalist, a firm believer in the supremacy of German weapons and the German mind, he's quite sure that after the final victory, we will also get the Swedes to come back with them, hand them over. So for him, it was just a matter of postponing the deportation, but there was no doubt that in his mind, in Hitler's mind, they were supposed to be killed in the end.
We had a question about a work of fiction, because a lot of people, we're a library and they do learning through fiction. Is there any works that come to mind that do accurately depict the escape and the rescue, in your opinion? I mean, of course, you're going to point to
non-English. There are memoirs, but if you're talking about fiction, most of the fiction that I know of that has been written in English is or children's books or books targeting young people. And there are a few books. There's one about the Henny and her boat, and there's the book Number the Stars, which also is telling the story from a child's perspective. I believe Hannah Kaufmann's memoirs. Hannah Kaufmann became a media celebrity in Denmark after the war, and I believe her. And she was a refugee from Germany in Denmark, and I believe her memoirs have also been translated into various languages. But I have to warn against the tendency, which is particularly strong in literature and also in film, in fiction film, addressing this issue, which is the tendency of describing everything as a marvel, as kind of an adventurous story, kind of a miracle. One of the films that exists is called Miracle at Midnight. And I hope that what I was saying was making clear that it was not a miracle, but it was a situation where the rescue grew out of specific structures in society and specific value systems, which were not completely correlating with each other, but still worked together in creating this mindset. We have to help the minority, a minority that is threatened. We have to help them. whether we want it or not, in order to protect the minority, but also to protect our own value system, our own political system.
Okay, so I can't thank you enough for doing this. It was absolutely amazing.
I could mention another memoir
Sure.
which was published very early in the United States, Ove Bertelsen, and it's called October 43, a book which was published in the 50s already. And Ove Bertelsen was like one of the leaders of one of the most successful rescue organizations. So that might also be a place to turn to.
Right, and I think it's also important that a lot of money changed hands.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because you had said to me at one point that it was like the price of a small car, really. You know.
It was. I mean, in those days, well, Denmark had a lot of cars. I mean, only the US and Canada had more cars per 100 inhabitants than Denmark, and Denmark was a car-producing country. You don't believe that, but Ford, General Motors, Citroën, Mercedes-Benz, they all had factories in Denmark. So Denmark was highly motorized. But in those days, there was no petrol. So all the cars were in garages and they couldn't be used. How did I get onto that track?
Well, because I said it costs what a car costs. So.
Yeah, sure. So we know that in the beginning, some of the very wealthy Jews wanted to get across already before the warning came out, already during September. And to them, in that situation, money didn't matter. So amongst the fishermen, this created this idea that a lot could be gained from the Jews. And some of the fishermen really had anti-Semitic stereotypes in their mind, like all Jews are rich and we fishermen are poor, so let's just take as much as possible. So there were some of the fishermen who really got very rich and who also, you could say, were not very moral in their behavior. But at least, and this is the difference from many of the other German-occupied countries, at least they delivered. At least they did transport the people in almost all of the cases. The price, I mean, it's difficult to compare over 80 years, but it's true that if we compare the price of one average transportation, one person, it's about half the year's salary of an unskilled laborer. And this is the price of a small car, a small electric car would cost the same. So the Jews had to come up with a lot of money. The Steinbock family and the Altermann family had to get together 7,000 kroner, which is 14 times the average salary of an unskilled worker for a year. A lot of money. Fortunately, Leibko Altermann was a wealthy person and could bring in the money that the Steinbock family didn't have, coming from the poor background.
So I think for our last question, somebody would like to know, Al would like to know, what percentage of the Danish Jews returned?
Almost everyone. Almost everyone returned. And interesting enough, not only those who were Danish Jews who had been raised and born in Denmark, but also the Jewish refugees, those who had come from Germany, from Czechoslovakia, from Austria to Denmark. Most of them also returned to Denmark. Very few actually ended up in Israel, very few in the United States, but some did. And of course, very few went back to the countries of origin to find out that there was nothing left, no Jewish life left in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Germany. And they were welcomed back, and the city of Copenhagen, where most of the Jews had lived, actually put up a special kind of help service in order to help those who had lost their homes or lost their apartments, get back on foot and get a place to stay, a place to live, which was very difficult in those days because we had there was a lack of what do you call it? Well, lack of homes, lack of apartments in Denmark. But most of the Jews were welcomed back. On the other hand, to many Jews, the experience of having to like kind of throw everything what you have in your hands and just break up and get away kept staying inside them as an experience that was very difficult to handle. So they never, many of the Jews who came back, okay, they were welcomed back by Rabbi Melchior, Ben Melchior, Marcus Melchior. Both of them have emphasized this a lot. Here is a population that is welcoming us back and not making new pogroms or something like this. But the feeling that something might hit you because you're Jewish would stay inside, even those who felt that they were welcomed back. When is it going to happen again? When can this happen again? And this is, I guess, a feeling that even transcends the generation, because the children sense it and the children also grow up with this feeling. So, okay, we feel safe, but we can't feel 100% safe.
Okay, so again, I cannot thank you enough. This is incredibly fascinating